May 22, 1816. Littleport, England. The first sound isn't the riot, it's the church bell, a frantic, hammering clang of iron on iron, not calling to prayer, but sounding an alarm. Then comes the crash. A rock, slick with Fenland mud, sails through the window of the globe-in. Glass explodes across the floor, mixing with the stink of spilled ale. Reverend John Vachel, the local magistrate, feels the vibration through the soles of his boots. He stands alone, clutching a piece of paper he can't bring himself to read, the riot act. Outside, a roar goes up. He knows these men. He christened their children, buried their parents. These are eel catchers, peat diggers, and Waterloo veterans, home from fighting Napoleon, only to find a new war waiting for them, a war against a piece of chalk on a price board. Another crash. The board itself, listing the price of bread, oats, and bacon, is ripped from the inn wall and shatters on the cobblestones. The numbers that governed their lives are now just meaningless white dust. One question hangs in the smoke-filled air, more dangerous than any stone. How did a volcano half a world away get 5 men from this tiny English town hanged? The story of that broken board doesn't start in the fens of England. It starts a year earlier, and 10,000 kilometers away, with a sound that broke the world. April 10, 1815. Mount Tambora, on the island of Sumbawa, Indonesia. For a week, it had grumbled. Now, it detonates. This isn't an eruption, it's a planetary-scale explosion, a volcanic explosivity index 7 event. The single loudest sound in recorded human history. On Sumatra, 2,600 kilometers away, Sir Stamford Raffles, the British governor, hears it and thinks it's cannon fire. He sends out patrols, searching for a naval battle that isn't there. The real war is happening in the sky. 150 cubic kilometers of pulverized rock, ash, and sulfur are blasted into the atmosphere. The eruption column punches 43 kilometers straight up, into the stratosphere, where the weather is made. And there, it stays. Down below, the immediate horror is absolute. Pyroclastic flows, superheated avalanches of gas and rock, scour villages from the map. The sky goes black for days. Ash buries farms so deep that archaeologists will one day find them a meter under the surface. 90,000 people die, first from the blast, then from the famine and disease that follow, a silent, choking plague. But the deadliest part of Tambora wasn't the ash that fell. It was the ash that didn't. A vast, invisible veil of sulfate aerosols begins to drift, high above the clouds, riding the jet streams like a ghost. This veil is a mirror, reflecting sunlight back into space. And as it spreads, it begins to turn down the thermostat of the entire planet. The world is about to learn a terrible lesson. Civilization is a function of the weather. The first dispatches of this new war are written in ice. In Greenland and Antarctica, scientists will later find a thin, gray layer of Tambora sulfate, a fingerprint of the catastrophe frozen in the polar cores. But the first people to feel it aren't scientists. They're farmers. Like Benjamin Harwood, in his field in Bennington, Vermont. The spring of 1816 had been unervingly cold. On May 12, a hard frost killed the fruit tree buds. But June would be better. It had to be. On June 5, the sun came out, warm and hopeful. Farmers across New England rushed to plant their corn. Then came June 6. A cold front from Canada hit the warm air, and the sky exploded in thunderstorms. The temperature plummeted. Rain turned to sleet, and then, to snow. 6 inches of heavy, wet snow fell on his newly planted fields. Harwood wrote in his diary, the heads of all the mountains on every side were crowned with snow. The most gloomy and extraordinary weather ever seen. By June 8, Cabot, Vermont had 18 inches of snow. Frozen songbirds dropped dead from the sky. Farmers who had just shorn their sheep desperately tried to tie the fleeces back on, but thousands of the animals froze to death anyway. They called it 1800 and froze to death. It was a joke told through chattering teeth. The corn, the staple crop they depended on for everything, turned black and brittle in the fields. There would be no harvest. Not this year. For thousands, a choice was crystallizing: starve where you are, or abandon your home and walk west. But what if you couldn't leave? What if you were trapped on an island with a government that had just made a catastrophic decision? While Vermont's farmers stared at snowy fields, Britain was staring at a different problem: peace. The Napoleonic Wars were finally over. 20 years of continent-spanning conflict had ended at Waterloo. But victory had a price. Thousands of demobilized soldiers were flooding the labor market, looking for work that wasn't there. And the government of Lord Liverpool had just lit a match. In 1815, fearing that cheap foreign grain would flood the market and lower their profits, the wealthy landowners who dominated Parliament passed the Corn Laws. These laws imposed massive tariffs, effectively blocking the import of cheap grain unless prices in Britain reached near famine levels. It was a law designed to protect the rich at the direct expense of the poor. They were betting that the harvests would be good. And then, Tambora's ash cloud arrived. The summer of 1816 in Europe wasn't just cold, it was biblical. Relentless, driving rain. The sky was a permanent, formless gray ceiling. Switzerland's hunger jar, the year of hunger. Ireland saw its potato and oat crops fail, triggering a typhus epidemic that killed tens of thousands. And in England, the rain fell and fell. The canals, the arteries of the nation's commerce, flooded. The roads turned to impassable mud. The price of oats, the fuel for the nation's horses, tripled. The very engine of transport was starving to death. And because of the corn laws, there was no relief. There were no ships of cheap grain arriving from America or Russia. The law had locked the door and thrown away the key. All across the country, the price boards in market towns began to creep upwards. Bread, the staple of life, was becoming a luxury. And in the fenlands of Cambridgeshire, men who had faced Napoleon's cannons were now facing empty plates. Their patience was about to break. The climate crisis wasn't just causing riots. It was also, in the strangest of circumstances, creating a monster. Thousands of kilometers from the hunger of Littleport, another group of English exiles was trapped by the same relentless rain. On the shores of Lake Geneva, at the Villa Diodati, Lord Byron, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and his 18-year-old mistress, Mary Godwin, were prisoners of the gloomy, ungenial summer. Day after day, lightning clawed at the Alps as thunder rolled across the water. Incessant rain often confined us for days to the house, Mary would later write. To pass the time, they read German ghost stories. One stormy night, Byron issued a challenge: we will each write a ghost story. For days, Mary struggled. She was surrounded by two of the greatest literary geniuses of the age. What could she possibly write? Then, one night, after a long conversation about galvanism and the possibility of reanimating a corpse, she went to bed. She couldn't sleep. With her eyes closed, she had what she called a waking dream. I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together, she recalled. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then, on the working of some powerful engine, show signs of life. She was terrified. But in that terror, she found her story. The oppressive, unnatural weather, born from a volcano's rage, had pushed them all inward, into the darker landscapes of the imagination. And in that darkness, Mary Shelley, a teenager trapped by the rain, conceived of Frankenstein. A story not about a monster, but about what happens when a creator refuses to take responsibility for the thing he has made. From monsters to machines. While Mary Shelley was dreaming of unnatural creation, another mind, starved by the same crisis, was inventing a new way to move. In Mannheim, Germany, the price of oats had made horses, the equivalent of our cars, trucks, and trains combined, an impossible luxury. The streets were filled with the skeletal remains of animals that had starved or been slaughtered for meat. The engine of society had seized. Baron Karl Dreis, a German civil servant, saw the problem. He reasoned that if you couldn't feed the engine, you had to replace it. In 1817, he unveiled his invention, the loft machine, or running machine. We know it by its English nickname, the dandy horse. It was a simple, radical idea: 2 wheels in a line, a seat, and a handlebar for steering. No pedals. You pushed it with your feet. It looked absurd. The crowds laughed. But then they watched as Dreis covered 7 kilometers in under an hour, faster than a mail coach on a good day. It was the world's first bicycle, a direct response to a climate shock. A desperate, ingenious pivot born from a world that could no longer afford the horsepower it was built on. All these threads, the ash, the snow, the rain, the hunger, the laws, the monsters, the machines, they all lead back to that broken price board in Littleport. On the night of May 22nd, the men leaving the globe and weren't just drunk, they were desperate. They marched through the town, armed with heavy sticks and stolen punt guns. They went from house to house, demanding money, food, and a reduction in the price of bread. When they reached the home of the Reverend Vachel, the magistrate, he tried to reason with them. He read the Riot Act, the formal legal order to disperse. They laughed in his face. One of the ringleaders, a man named Isaac Harley, leveled a pistol at him. Vachel's home was ransacked. The mob ruled for 2 days. But the law, as the judge would later say, is always stronger than its assailants. A militia, led by a fiercely anti-radical baronet named Sir Henry Bate Dudley, marched from Ely, backed by professional soldiers, the Royal Dragoons. They cornered the last of the rioters in a pub. In the chaos, a soldier was shot and wounded. A rioter was shot and killed. The uprising was over. 82 people were arrested. The trials were swift. 24 were sentenced to death. But the Crown wanted a lesson, not a massacre. The sentences for 19 were commuted to prison or transportation for life to Australia. 5 were singled out to be an example. William B. Miss, George Crowe, John Dennis, Isaac Harley, and Thomas South. On June 28, 1816, under a cold, grey sky that still refused to become summer, they were hanged in public at Ely. Their bodies were placed in a common grave, marked by a stone that read, "May their awful fate be a warning to others." What is the blueprint here? First, the fragility of the system. A world just emerging from 20 years of war assumed the biggest threat was another army. They never thought to look up. One volcano, one shift in the weather, tested their entire political and economic settlement harder than Napoleon ever could. Second, the politics of disaster. The Tambora eruption was a natural disaster. The famine in Britain was a man-made one. The Corn Laws turned a crisis into a catastrophe. It was a policy decision that chose to protect the profits of the powerful over the lives of the hungry, and when the system broke, it broke precisely along those lines of class and privilege. And finally, innovation under pressure. The crisis forced open the most unexpected doors. It gave us a dark masterpiece of literature that still shapes our debates about science and responsibility. It gave us the prototype for the bicycle, a machine of elegant simplicity that would one day change the world. Crisis breaks things, yes. But it also reveals, and it reroutes. The turning points are brutal. In Britain, the government doubles down. They keep the Corn Laws, choosing stability for the wealthy landowners over cheap bread for the people. The result is a decade of radicalism and protest, a slow-burning civil conflict. In America, thousands of families in New England make a different choice. They vote with their feet. They pack their belongings, abandon their frozen farms, and begin the great migration west into the Ohio Valley, forever shifting the center of the young republic. And in culture, Frankenstein goes to press in 1818, a moral fable born from a climate shock, a warning that will outlive the weather that inspired it. The bill is counted in graves, from the ash fields of Sumbawa to the typhus wards of Ireland, to that common grave in Ely. It's counted in the lost homesteads of Vermont, and in the lost faith in governments who discovered, too late, that a cloud of ash moves faster than a convoy of grain. The entire crisis is there on that shattered chalkboard. Oats up. Bread up. Tempers up. Gallows up. This isn't an exotic pattern, it's a timeless one. Overconfidence in our systems. Protectionism that curdles into cruelty. Grim, clever improvisation. A VEI-7 eruption is not a black swan event, it's a recurring one. And our modern food system is a miracle of efficiency, but also a glass house of interdependence. Just-in-time logistics, container ships crossing oceans, crop yields dependent on fuel and fertilizer prices set in distant capitals. The connections are faster now, which means the contagion of crisis can also be faster. Policy still determines whether a shock becomes a headline or a famine. Tariffs, export bans, emergency stockpiles, and political will are the levees that stand between a bad harvest and a broken society. And we are still wrestling with Frankenstein's question, what do we owe the things we create? A question that haunts our modern debates about geoengineering, about deliberately creating our own stratospheric veils to hold back the sun. The final, chilling verdict is this: the last battle of the Napoleonic era wasn't fought at Waterloo. It was fought in the stratosphere. It was a war against a global climate shift, and it was fought with laws, and ropes, and hunger. And in our supply chains, our parliaments, and our laboratories, that war is still being fought today. That's why we do this. To map the shockwaves of the past to understand the fault lines of the present. If you believe this work is vital, then join the daily investigation. Subscribe, and become part of a team that holds the present accountable to the past. Now, for the final question. Imagine you are Reverend Vachel in Littleport. The angry crowd is at your door. The shattered price board is at your feet. You have the chalk in your hand. What price for a loaf of bread do you write on that board to stop the riot? And whose hunger, ultimately, are you responsible for? Let me know your verdict in the comments.